Hungary criminalizes aid to asylum seekers. We speak with the OSCE representative Alan Desir about media freedom in Ukraine. Is Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov rebuilding the Syrian city of Aleppo?
The murder of a Roma peasant by a far-right group has shocked Ukraine. On June 23rd, a group of masked young men attacked a Roma camp located on the outskirts of Lviv, leaving one person dead and 4 injured. This is the 5th widely reported attack on the Roma community in Ukraine within just last 2 months. Within the last years, hundreds of programs had been run in Ukraine to promote tolerance and anti-discrimination. While very rare when the crime happens, those investigations are opened as hate crimes. This time, the head of the national police had condemned an attack and promised to take active preventive measures. But what does this incident mean for Ukraine, Ukrainian law enforcement and the society? We'll have discussion here, but before we watch the report by our correspondent Ostap Yarish from Lviv.
Bloodstains, children's toys and personal belongings. We are currently at the Roma camp that was attacked on June 23rd. It's empty and messy here. The Roma who used to live here were taken to a safe spot and provided with shelter. It's not clear yet whether they will come back to pick up their possessions. One of the Roma people who stayed at this camp died as a result of a stab wound he received. The perpetrators had carried out the attack in the middle of the night without warning, but it looks like they have been preparing for this thoroughly for a long time. 14 people were at the camp during the attack, 10 adults and 4 children. A pregnant woman was also among them. One of the Roma people who had been injured is a 19-year-old man from the Zakarpattia region. He came to Lviv with his relatives to collect metal, glass, paper and hand them in for recycling. He was attacked in his sleep with a knife, receiving injuries to his chest, back and leg.
There are 10 perpetrators. I received 5 blows here and 4 here and 1 stab wound here. We were asleep inside the tent. They had 1 metal bar, a hammer, a knife, and everything.
11 young men aged 16 to 18, as well as a 20-year-old organizer of the attack. The majority of them are senior students in Lviv schools. They identified themselves as members of an ultra-right-wing organization, Sober and Evil Youth. The group has a Telegram channel and a YouTube channel named Lemberg Jugend, where they post racist and neo-Nazi content. However, the channel only has a few dozen subscribers. The school, which is attended by 5 of the young men, commented that they could never have imagined that the teenagers would have been capable of such violence.
These children are actually sociable and not aggressive. They have never been part of any conflicts or fights. This never happened. Quite the opposite. The kids took part in various activities. They were involved in charity. They helped us with different projects. We informed them about conflicts and different situations that can arise during communication with different members of society. So we really are shocked that they're part of this case.
The National Police told us that the attackers had organised the plan and even assigned tasks and roles. Thanks to a timely call, the police managed to arrive at the scene promptly and detain the attackers who had attempted to flee. Supervision of other Roma settlements is kept under special control, according to law enforcement officers.
Concerning the increased patrolling, it's been enforced for around a month now, probably. It was a command from the Interior Ministry. This also concerns all the attacks on Roma ethnic minorities. All of this is under close monitoring by Ukraine's national police, and there is increased patrolling in pop-up and compact settlements that we know of.
Attitudes towards visiting Roma vary among the local population, from tolerant to highly negative. This topic of conversation usually comes up during warmer parts of the year, when wandering Roma from Zakarpattia begin to travel to other Ukrainian cities in search of income. Mykola Yurchenko, head of a Roma organization in Lviv, states that the sort of camp that was attacked was not the only one in the Lviv region.
We had around 800 people last year. All of them were traveling Roma coming from the Zakarpattia region. They travel around the whole of Ukraine. In the Lviv region itself, there were about 800 people. I think at the moment we have at least 800 of them too, but they live in small compact settlements of 2 to 3 families of up to 50 people. Some of them are smaller, of up to 15 people. They're scattered, but most of them are located around the Rudne settlement. People here don't understand that you can't see in black and white. All of us are citizens of Ukraine. It's not the problem of international establishments or civil societies. It's our government's problem that such actions are carried out against their citizens.
The international community did offer a response. The attack on the camp in Lviv has already been condemned by the United States, as well as the Council of Europe. The Roma people who were attacked and, as a result frightened, refused to talk to journalists and cooperate with the police. After the attack, they wanted to return home to Zakarpattia. Meanwhile, suspects in the attack are facing up to 15 years to life imprisonment for intentional homicide motivated by racist attitudes.
So we are happy to discuss the situation with Zola Kondor, who is a human rights activist and representative of Roma Coalition, and of course Oleksiy Biloshitsky, who is the first deputy of the Petrol Police Department. So it's really good to have both of you here together. But probably my first question would be to Zola. Really, you know, everywhere there are the issues, and there are the issues with the violence against minorities, and in particularly against Roma people. And there are numerous programs in Ukraine, there are always talks, but what do you see new? And this particular tragedy with the death of the murder of the man, what is different? Is it a point of no return? How do you treat that? What are also your questions to the police?
For this question, actually, of course, there is no point to return after the death and the murder of this young man and attack of the radical group against Roma settlement in Lviv particularly. As we see it at the moment, the law enforcement is doing their best to protect the Roma settlement and the victims of this attack. And maybe this can be as an example that the police can do their best in protecting Roma people in Ukraine. Because in the rest of the cases, the 5 cases of attacks that we had before, unfortunately, the police wasn't able to protect effectively the Roma settlements and those people who were living in them. And of course, we had many discussions with the law enforcement and different departments of the police regarding the attacks and the waves and increasing of radical groups or radicalization in Ukraine. And there is no one answer to that. And I think that it's a matter and the problem that should be solved comprehensively, not only by the police, but also by the state institutions and including civil society and Ukrainian society in general.
But Oleksiy, there were at least 5 cases, we do have the article, where of the attacks on the Roma camps, and they were not investigated earlier. Also, if we speak about the crime, it would be never mentioned that it's a hate crime. You know, usually when the Roma settlements or the minorities are attacked, it's usually the hooliganism, and also in particular this atmosphere of impunity, that what leads to the violence that we already speak openly. So really, you know, you can speak how good police can try to solve the particular recent case, but how it had happened. What you would answer on that previously, within the couple of last months, there were some of the pogroms in different cities. So those pogroms, when they were not stopped, they were somehow tolerated, they led to this particular crime.
First of all, thank you for having me. And I'll gladly answer your question on the process of let's say, as you said, that there were a couple of cases of pogroms, and I do not agree with you that no actions were taken and the cases were not investigated. Actually, every in each case is being investigated now, and the criminal case was started just after those cases. The process of investigation, on the other hand, wasn't publicly, disclosed and publicly maybe expressed. Maybe that was I wouldn't say it was a mistake. It might have been a mistake. It might have been a miscalculation. But usually, as you know, the criminal process and investigative process is there is a secret of investigation, and it has to be protected. So maybe because of that, the investigators didn't come publicly forward. But as you may know, the last case in Lviv, practically all the suspects were arrested on the spot, and also the patrol police officers were involved in this arrest and basically physically arrested those people. And you know that there were already the hearings on the on their case for the future. I mean the measures that are going to be taken for those 7 people, like an arrest or the other possibilities, but the court chose to keep them under arrest. So I wouldn't say that no measures were, no actions were taken. The actions were taken, but even if the investigation is started with different article, the investigative process and the evidence that the investigators collect, they lead to different conclusions. And the article for them with which the investigators go to the court, the articles may change. So it depends on what evidence will find the investigators in the process of the investigation. It depends on what conclusions they have in the end.
Zola, would you really agree with that? Because we're talking to the lawyers, and there is a trend of really undermining this particular kind of crime, and we don't see really people being punished. So what would you reply?
Well,
are you satisfied with the investigations?
With all the respect to our colleague and other colleagues, who some of them are really trying to be helpful in all these incidents, and I have to mention Oksana Sanagurska in Lviv police, who is really helping to collect the information and really trying to be the first one to address different issues in Lviv region. But unfortunately, if we take the statistic and try to analyze it, out of 6 cases, attacks, hate attacks against Roma settlements, how many court decisions do we have, or how many courts already started hearing or investigations regarding these attacks, and how many people were punished, for example? Particularly, we have only one last case when we have the killed person, when 8 people were detained, and now the court process will start. Regarding the rest of the cases, even if, for example, in Ternopil case, when the group of people was kind of taken to police department right after the attack that they did, after a few hours they were released, because these guys said that they were practicing or exercising in the forest. And in most of the cases we can see that it's only hooliganism, but not hate attack, or not Article 161 was applied to these attacks. So that's why, of course, we are very much concerned about this situation. We continue to say that we are open for cooperation with the police and law enforcement institutions, but we do not see proper investigation. And it's not only from the side of Roma organizations. If you will see the statements of the Council of Europe, Secretary General, the ODIHR director, the different embassies or heads of different international organizations, UN mission, and etc., they all expressed serious concerns about the situation, and they call the police for proper investigation.
Do you think that there is the stigma against Roma is existing globally in Eastern Europe, but, there is something we can do about our society? So, would you share, and would you really disagree also that there is a particular stigma also among the police regarding some particular groups, including as Roma? And because there is always, when you really follow today the discussion in the Ukrainian society, there would be talks that, okay, they overtake some part of lands illegally, you have the issues of like begging, criminality, those talks are there. So what you would ask, what do you do with that?
Actually, I wouldn't get deep into the talks and who is talking, because every person has his or her own opinion and view, but as a police officer he or she has to express the legal opinion and what is according to the law. And I would like to repeat myself in that police will definitely have active reaction for any kind of situations that we are discussing. So it doesn't matter who has what personal opinion inside, but as police officer, they will all serve their society and their people. And if they won't do so, they're going to be punished according to the disciplinary statute and all the other legislation.
So, do you agree that, or what do you think? Do you think that stigma is existing also among the law enforcement, among the judges, among, the part of the society which, up to whom it's to execute the decision against discrimination?
As a non-governmental organization, we are doing lots of trainings for police officers. Some years ago, we did also for judges. We do trainings for teachers, for social workers. And in every group, we will always have a person with stigma or stereotypes or very negative experience with the Roma people and etc. Of course, police officers are also humans, and they might have different experience and stereotypes regarding different people. It doesn't matter, is it Roma or not Roma. But what is most important, as our colleague said, that these people are not using, or these stereotypes are not leading these people in their actions. And of course, we have lots of cases when teachers or social workers or judges were making different decisions or actions, just being led by their personal experience or etc. And that's why it's very important to work with the people to overcome these stereotypes, or just to teach them how to hide or forget about that during their work or professional activities.
Thanks a lot for the conversation and for the answers. I really hope our audience understands better what the Ukrainians are thinking, how the Ukrainian both activists and police are treating the issue. So that was Oleksiy Bilashitsky, who is the first deputy chief of the Petrol Police Department, and as well Zola Kondur, human rights activist and representative of Roma Coalition. But to provide you even more context, we would like to show you another report. As earlier on June 8th, members of the National Druzhina militia destroyed a Roma settlement in Halisievsky Park in Kiev. In a Facebook post hours before the attack, the National Druzhina, which was founded by veterans of the far-right Azov battalion, called for the Roma people to clear the territory, otherwise they will, quote, gather and mob. Our correspondent Igor Burdyga went to Halisievsky Park to find out more about this atrocity, as well as to speak to members of the Roma community. So let's take a look.
On June 7th, journalists from the ICTV channel arrived to a Roma camp in Kiev. They came with another right-wing radical group, National Druzhina, claiming that this was a security measure. The visit was broadcast on Facebook by the first deputy chairman of the National Corps, Nazary Kravchenko.
Если, пацаны, если лица кому-то нельзя палить, лучше пусть отойдите на задний план.
Мы никому не трогаем, 20 лет тут живем.
The police arrived at the camp shortly after the ultra-right radicals, but it turned out they weren't very keen on the Roma presence either.
One could say that they also do a lot of harm, small crimes. But we can't really kick them out. Why do you think we'd want them to live here? Everyone should live where they have a house and residence permit.
With the influx of journalists, police, and radicals, the Roma decided to abandon the forest. To make sure the Roma community had nowhere to return to, the National Drużyna members decided to destroy their homes, claiming to be clearing the forest. The attack was broadcast on their official Facebook page.
Инвалид вроде, видите, с пальцем. Но нормально у него все. Какое-то у него приспособление специально для очистки леса, видите, на плече. Вот. Что он с ним будет делать? Сейчас посмотрите в прямом эфире. Давай, пацаны, ломайте все вообще. Так. Работают национальные дружины, делайте.
Я уже не могла и выше ничего.
Вы зачем котенка съесть хотели? А?
Что?
Котенка кто хотел съесть?
Что за котенок?
The inhabitants who started gathering around the time of the attack were harassed and even beaten. The police just calmly watched the whole thing.
We are here to maintain public order.
After the attack was over, Metropolitan Police reported that they had managed to prevent any violations in conflicts. However, a few hours later, law enforcement officers opened criminal proceedings for the hooliganism charges.
In the framework of criminal proceedings, all active participants in the event will be identified and brought to justice. The police will react strongly to violations of the law, regardless of which organizations the perpetrators are members of. No one has the right to carry out illegal actions, impose pseudo-ultimatums, or publicly broadcast attacks against other citizens for the sake of public relations, particularly in relation to representatives of ethnic minorities.
National Drużyna returned the next day to remove what was left of the camp, posing for the cameras in protective gear. The Roma had to leave the city immediately.
I'm heading home to Zakarpattia, to Berehovo. I was there a month ago, gathering metal. I have a lot of grandchildren. I have to earn.
The Roma returned to Berehovo, where they live in poverty. Soon they will head out again to look for work.
Я 2 года дома не был. Кочевал туда-сюда, ездил? Не, на том месте жил. Страшно. Страшно. 2 человека еще даже не нашли.
З сполученням Київ-Солотвино поїзд знаходиться на 3-й колії.
The full version of all our interviews and reports are available on our webpage en.hromadske.ua. Also sign up for our newsletter if you would like to receive Hromadske International weekly highlights. The sign-up box is on our upper right hand of our webpage. As well, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Search Hromadske International, and we'll be back in a second. It's nearly 50 days since the Ukrainian filmmaker from Crimea, Oleg Sentsov, started his hunger strike. His sole demand is the release of all political prisoners held in Russia. Throughout all these days, Ukrainian activists tried to raise attention of the Ukrainian government and international community. As we know, Sentsov's health is deteriorating. What we can do at this point as journalists is just to remind. Sentsov was arrested in annexed Crimea 4 years ago and is serving his term in northern Siberia. While we are speaking about conflict resolution between Russia and Ukraine, the issue of the annexed Crimea is set aside, especially if we compare it to the Donbas. Yet it doesn't mean that there is no any military development in the region. We may say no shots have been fired and no major incidents have occurred, but the appearance of Russian vessels, as well as an FSB border service, signal heightening tension over the Azov Sea, a possible new battlefront in the conflict between our countries. And to discuss the situation, we have with us Alexander Hara, who is the expert of the Maidan of the Foreign Affairs. This is an organization which is keeping a track on anything which is happening also with Crimea and with the breach of the international legislation regarding the Crimea. So we're discussing this de facto blockade of the Azov Sea. So what are the recent developments? What are the most urgent things people need to know besides what we've just
First of all, I should say that it's not an isolated incident. It's just unfolding aggression that we've seen in Crimea in 2014 and then in Donbass. So Russians are connecting to theaters of war in Donbass and Crimea by making this blockade of Ukrainian Azov Sea ports and stopping the vessels, international vessels, shipping to and from Ukrainian cities goods. So far we have almost 60 vessels being stopped and searched by the FSB, Russian Security Service, on the ground that they are preparing or counter-terrorism, they are conducting counter-terrorism operations. And everything began with the actually with the illegal building of the bridge via the Kerch Strait. From that time, they were stopping vessels. They were closing the sea for any movements. Actually, the blockade began in April 2015. It caused a huge damage to the ports of Mariupol. The turnover dropped 15%, and to Berdansk almost 1/3. So the idea of the Russians is just to threaten the international businesses from shipping goods to Ukraine and from Ukraine in Azov Sea ports.
I would like probably to also show that, because we have this map prepared. So those are the Ukrainian ports and, you know, the annexed Crimea, the very thin line, and obviously this is Russia, yes. So all the Ukrainian vessels have to come through this, and now we do have the bridge. So really, how did the bridge change the situation? We showed that it didn't let the bigger vessels to come through.
Yes, Panamax vessels are unable to pass the Kerch Strait because of their heights and because of their dead weight. It's up to 15 meters short, the bridge short, then Panamax is capable of passing through it. So the Russians made it deliberately. From one hand, the Kerch Strait is 8 meters deep, and it means that not all the vessels, Panamax vessels, could pass the strait in general. But if it's half loaded, it's possible to pass the strait and then to load in Mariupol and Berdansk.
So one of the theses is that Russia can use also this as some kind of a blackmail of Ukraine, for instance, to provide the Dnieper water to Crimea or any other things, to let the Ukrainian vessels come. So really, can Russia, especially while keeping the Crimea annexed, still demand something from Ukraine?
Oh, yeah, sure. Firstly, we should consider it as a next step of militarization of the region, because we have 40,000 strong military in Crimea. We have capable of nuclear strike vessels in Crimea and other military equipment. Now they are militarizing the Azov Sea. This is a major issue. Via militarization, they are making some difficulty, causing some difficulties for the shipments. because the east of Ukraine and especially Donetsk and Mykolaiv region depend on the ports of Mariupol and Berdyansk, it means that there will be economic damage to these cities and to these regions. It means that the population would be not happy with that, demanding some action from the government in Kiev, and the social and political situation would be destabilized. So it's not just about the passage of the vessels, it's about undermining Ukrainian sovereignty, militarizing the both seas, and then unfolding aggression in other directions.
And how much the Ukrainian government can do in this situation, and also what could be done on the international level? Because, you know, there is a general understanding that there is not that much the international community also can do regarding anything connected to Crimea so far.
Well, first and foremost, Russians are those guys, they respect force, and that's why we need to enforce, to have military strengthened, I mean, the navy. Secondly, there are several legal actions that they could make. Firstly, we should cancel the agreement as OSCE of 2003 that is making possible from the legal point of view for the Russian military and certainly civilian vessels to be on the shore of Ukrainian. So we don't have a state border with Russia in Azov Sea, in Kerch Strait, and beyond in the Black Sea, I mean between mainland of Russia and Crimea. So we need to cancel this agreement. It will give us the other framework, the International Sea Convention that is demanding the other power to request the entrance clearance for 24 nautical miles. Now the Russians can be just offshore of Ukraine. A third one, according to the information available, the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry applied for the arbitrage for high seas, and they filed the case. So we'll see some movement there. But certainly it will take time to have this court decision, not the court, but the arbitrary decision. It can take a couple of years. What we've seen now, the Russians began with they stopped vessels for a couple of hours. Today, one of the Turkish vessels has been kept for 3.5 days. So the Russians are increasing these tensions. They are just escalating the situation because there was no adequate response from the military side, from the bodyguards of Ukraine.
So thanks a lot. What is clear that there should be more said about this situation because it is developing, and we'll follow this story. Thank you. That was Alexander Hara, an expert of the Maidan for Foreign Affairs. What's more, Russia's actions in the Azov Sea, combined with construction of the Kerch Bridge connecting mainland Russia and annexed Crimea, is also affecting the local economy in Ukraine, as access to the ports is now restricted. I suggest we watch our report.
We are currently in the Donetsk region in the city of Mariupol along the Azov coast. This past month, the crisis has escalated in this area. Russian border guards stopped virtually every vessel moving in the direction of the Ukrainian ports, searching it and checking the identities of its crew members. The Mariupol Sea Guard detachment controls the coast of the Azov Sea within the Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. The situation around the Ukrainian coast of Azov is being closely monitored around the clock. Almost daily, Ukrainian border guards record the detainment of ships trying to head into the ports of Mariupol and Berdyansk by the Russians.
The current situation in the Azov Sea is highly complicated, as there have been repeated instances of provocations by the Russians. This includes the stopping of trade and fishing vessels. All of this can be considered a provocation from the Russians. The Mariupol Sea Guard detachment regularly sends out tactical groups for patrols and monitoring the coastal line, which they are responsible for.
Russia is gradually strengthening its presence in the Azov Sea, to which extent they transfer ships from the Caspian Sea. Border guards indicate that the actions by Russia mark a desire to establish sole control over the Azov Sea. They're preparing for the worst-case scenario. The fundamentals of the crisis were laid down even before Russian armed aggression over Ukraine, when most of the coast of the Azov Sea, as well as the navigable channel in the Kerch Strait, belonged to Ukraine. Russia was not happy with the situation, and in 2003 raised its first set of territorial grievances. This conflict was over the island of Tuzla. In September 2003, Russia started building a dam on the Kerch Strait from its coast to the Ukrainian island. When the Russian dam reached the Ukrainian border pontoon, negotiations began. As a result, in October 2003, the construction of the Russian dam was stopped 100 meters from the Ukrainian island, and in December of the same year, Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma and Russian President Vladimir Putin signed an agreement between Ukraine and Russia concerning the cooperative use of the Azov Sea and the Kerch Strait. This agreement declared that the Azov Sea and the Kerch Strait were historically inland waters. Warships and other vessels flying either the Ukrainian or Russian flag received full freedom of navigation. In fact, the agreement was to the satisfaction of Moscow's demands. The division of the Azov Sea and the Kerch Strait according to state borders, which Ukraine insisted on, did not happen. As a result, the norm of the international maritime law is not currently in place in the Azov Sea. The agreement concerning the use of the Azov Sea and the Kerch Strait becomes something more of a mine, which surfaced 11 years later. In 2014, Russia occupied both Crimea and the island of Tuzla, which was crucial for the construction of the Kerch Bridge. As the construction progressed, the Russians began behaving more brazenly in the Azov Sea. As of 2018, vessels operated by the FSB freely move around the Azov Sea, stopping vessels moving through the Kerch Strait and to Ukrainian ports daily to check and fully identify the crew. Experts call this a partial blockade of Ukrainian ports in the Azov Sea. In reality, this constitutes economic pressure on the Ukrainian regions of the Azov Sea. But the Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine has already created serious obstacles for potential investors. The current crisis in the Azov Sea has only worsened the situation. In other sectors of the enterprises owned by the Mariupol investment group, such as grain shipment and ship repair, losses are also great. Even those customers not deterred by the war are facing difficulties. The Kerch Bridge does not allow entry to vessels that measure more than 33 meters in height. With the loss of every fifth ship, businesses are facing around a 30% loss. Another thing that can affect big companies located on the Ukrainian Azov coast as much as Russian aggression does is panicking. Heads of ports and enterprises concentrated in Mariupol insist that it is necessary to focus on the development of new areas of activity in order to help keep investors interested. For the Mariupol commercial seaport, this direction is the construction of new terminals. After the launch of the terminal for the shipment of the metal sheet, there will be a grain terminal. Meanwhile, the crisis situation in the Azov Sea grows worse, and the Russians continue to use the treaty to economically suppress Ukraine and the region as a whole. Experts from the Maidan Foreign Affairs Organization have recorded cases of detention of vessels in the Kerch Strait and Azov Sea. They also draw attention to the lack of diplomatic reaction from Ukrainian authorities to the belligerent behavior of Russia in the Azov Sea.
Half the country is telling them to do something. This could go beyond the goal of social pressures in Berdyansk and Mariupol. This could be a part of a broader military political cooperation, which could concern not only the Azov Sea, but the Black Sea. Because of the potential of the Navy, we have some sort of coastal defense by both seas, but the one near the Azov Sea is not as good.
Experts predict several options for further development of the issue. Russia could strengthen its blockade of Ukrainian ports and try to unilaterally establish control over the Azov Sea, which could be a preparation for a new set of aggressive military actions on land. The information resistance community has provided its own analysis, where one of the hypotheses is that Russia is creating further conditions for trade, using its blockade of Ukrainian ports as leverage in exchange for the resumptions of supplies of Dnipro water to occupied Crimea. There is another interesting point. Unfortunately, the agreement of the use of the Azov Sea and Kerch Strait was proposed to be denounced as early as 2015, but the committee scrapped the bill because of the fear that the cancellation of contracts will lead to a blockade of Ukrainian ports. Their concerns weren't found.
parliament, led by Prime Minister Viktor Orban, had recently introduced a new set of laws which essentially criminalize the work of NGOs helping illegal immigrants seek asylum. This move comes amid rising populist and anti-immigration sentiments pushed by Orban and his party Fidesz. The European Union and the international community have criticized the law, dubbed the Stop Soros law, after US-born Hungarian billionaire philanthropist George Soros, who supports some of Hungary's liberal NGOs. Hromadski Maria Ulianovska spoke via Skype to Gergely Martin, an editor of Hungary's largest current affairs weekly, HVG, to find out what this means for Hungary's position in Europe and how the country's population has reacted to the new legislation.
This new law is a farce. It's a joke, but it can be very dangerous. You see, human trafficking is against the law in Hungary, and it was always it has always been. So there was no need for a new legislation of pointing the fingers at those who would help illegal migration, because you don't really know what that means. There's a new amendment to the Hungarian constitution now, which says that you can't be a fugitive if you arrive from a country which is secure. So it means that if you come from Serbia, you can't be a fugitive. That means that that on the border no one can help you. And actually, if you say someone which direction is Budapest, it could mean that you are arrested by the police. But how should you know as a civilian who's an illegal migrant and who is, let's say, a Serbian guy who just wants to visit Budapest? So this law is actually a joke, and we are very much afraid that it can be turned against anyone. You see, in that law, they sanction people who write in a positive manner about migration. This, in an extreme situation, can be used against media as well. So, you know, it's a stupid and very dangerous law, and nobody knows what the outcome going to be. And we see what's happening in Europe. We see what's happening with Salvini. We see what's happening with Austria and Bavaria. And we don't really think that Orban will be punished for this senseless law.
One other thing is that recently the Interior Minister justified the legislation, saying that the Hungarian people rightfully expect the government to use any means necessary to stop Hungary from becoming a country of immigrants. So, as a member of the European Union and the United Nations, does this mean that Hungary is releasing itself from the international obligations? And can we really talk about the possible Hoxit, the succession from the EU?
Well, you see how the EU is right now developing in a way that Mr. Orban likes. It's developing to be a continent and a union which turns its back to the world. So I don't think that there's going to be major retributions to the Hungarian government because of this law. This law really doesn't protect anyone, because all the means to protect our borders were there before. You know, that it's not a question of NGOs helping a few people. You know, we have border patrol, we have laws against trafficking. There was no real aim to do this new legislation, and it won't make us any safer. It is just, you know, a propaganda tool for Mr. Orban to use within Hungary and to brag in Europe. It is a provocation, and the one real threat here is that it can be used in the future against people who would, in the eyes of Mr. Orban, threaten his power.
So, talking about the name of the legislation itself, the Stop Soros Act. So Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban has numerously accused George Soros and his Open Society Foundation of promoting mass migration against the will of the Hungarian people. So how is the country changing with Soros's foundation closing its Budapest office?
Let's start with the name Stop Soros, or as we pronounce it. It's cynical and it's a lie. It won't stop Mr. Soros because he is simply not involved. Two, Mr. Soros saying the same as Mr. Orban, that no country should be forced to invite and welcome refugees. That the mass migration is a huge threat to the European Union because it stops the solidarity from within. I think the offices of Mr. Soros being moved from Budapest to Berlin is a scream, a way to say help from the foundation, to a consequence of the politics in Budapest. You must understand, Mr. Soros is not leaving any projects he is funding here in Budapest. He is only taking out the parts of the office which is working worldwide. So till today, let's say someone from Chile helped the health care in Tanzania and was working from a Budapest office. He's going to work now from a Berlin office. This makes Budapest a bit weaker because a lot of money leaves Budapest with it, but actually there's no direct threat to the Hungarian NGOs and no direct gain for Mr. Orban.
From 2016 murder of Pavel Sheremet to the more recent and bizarre sting operation involving Russian journalist Arkady Babchenko, it's clear that being a journalist in Ukraine is not without risk. The worrying number of these cases of journalists in Ukraine and Russia being targeted or persecuted for their work, as well as the way in which the authorities deal with them, raises serious questions about media freedom in the region. This was the subject of the OSCE organized conference held in Kyiv devoted to freedom and pluralism in Ukraine, where we caught up with the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, Arlem Desir. And what we discuss is really how much international community understand about the recent Babchenko case, as well are really we are living in the reality when the journalists becoming hostages. My first still would be the question regarding everything which happened to the Babchenko case. Yeah, there was a concern of the international community after. I knew you flew to Kyiv. So what happened next, and what is the conversation now with the whole case?
Yes, I was about to meet with the authorities and to meet with colleagues and with the journalist associations about this very grave announcement of the death of a journalist. And of course, when I learned that it has been a stage operation for the purpose of a special investigation or operation, I reacted that I was relieved that Babchenko was alive and well, of course, but also that it is very important that in investigating on threats and attacks against journalists, the authorities provide transparent information and true information.
Do you have it to this
No,
point?
I still don't have all the information about this event. I hear the declaration by the authority, by Prosecutor General, but I think and I wish that more information will come in the future. I think it's necessary. And it's very important in the fight against impunity that we ensure that when there has been crimes against journalists, like Pavel Sheremet, which we mentioned today in this conference, or Oleg Buzina, that there is all the necessary means which are put in place to ensure a proper investigation, to ensure that those who have been responsible for crimes, for attacks against journalists are identified, are brought to justice. And I think that regarding threats against journalists today, it's also important. Of course, I can understand that some of the information cannot be made public, but when information are made public, that they are the truth. And it's also important because we are at the age of fake news, of disinformation, of propaganda, and that Ukraine has been a victim of such practice of disinformation, that the authority makes the effort to only provide true information. And that's also a matter of credibility for themselves, and it's also an issue of credibility for the fight against those who want to attack the journalists.
So what would be for you enough justifiable information that, what kind of information it's necessary for you to know that, this operation was...
No, I say about the operations that I don't approve that kind of stage operation about the life of a journalist. I think that there should be no lie about the life or death of a journalist. What is now important is if the authorities have information about threats regarding Babchenko or other journalists. There was information about a list of targeted journalists, that this information are provided when the authorities think that it's possible, but that in the meantime there is no other kind of non-confirmed information which are put in circulation.
And the question which care a lot of Ukrainians about Sushchenko, about Ukrainian journalists being really for a long-term sentence in Russia. What international community can really do? Because it looks like there is no way to influence that. What are your next steps? And even there is a criticism that the case of Wyszynski here has a bigger international attention than that particular case.
For me, the release of Roman Sushchenko is a high priority. I raised this issue many times in many international fora, in Vienna, of course, where we are based, but also during my visit in Ukraine. But I also raised it in Russia, in Moscow, when I met with the authority. And it's clear that we cannot accept the idea that, now journalists are like hostages of international relation. I mean, the fact to be a journalist has not to become a crime. A state can disapprove the view of a journalist, but participating states in the OSCE have two very clear commitments about the fact to respect the work of journalists from other countries and even to facilitate their accreditation, the circulation of journalists. By the way, Roman Sushchenko was not in Russia for reporting, he was in Russia for private and family reason, and he has been arrested while he was not reporting. He was a very well-known journalist. He was established in Paris at that time as a correspondent for Ukraine Forum, and we really ask for his release, as we ask for the release and the free activity of Mykola Semena, who is de facto under house arrest in Crimea and who is now sanctioned and forbidden to exercise his profession as journalist, and who cannot leave Crimea, and he wants to join Ukraine, so it's very important that he become free. We also will dedicate a special time in this conference to speak about Oleg Sentsov and to ask for his release.
And in case of Wyszynski, the Ukrainian government provides some other evidence on, for instance, on his Russian cooperation, on his financial cooperation with Russia rather than journalists. What would say on this particular case?
Well, Wyszynski was established here as a journalist working for Russian media since a long time. His opinion were known. He was not supporting the position of the government, and that was a public aspect of his activity. So I think that journalists has to be respected as journalists, and that we cannot use them again as a kind of pawns in a fight against the state to try, I don't know what. Is it to exchange? Is it to put a pressure? So I think that one of the strong commitments of the OSCE is to accept the fact that a journalist from another country or from your country working for foreign media can operate. Of course, there can be rules, there can be some limits fixed under the law, but in respect of international standards, but it cannot put at risk the freedom of the journalist. So I have asked for the release of Wyszynski, and I think that journalism should not be criminalized.
There is no secret Moscow supports Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad and is involved in military operation against his opponents. The Syrian nation is divided over their views on Russia. Some thank Putin and some blame him for numerous deaths of civilians. Meanwhile, Putin's ally, the Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov, is splurging millions of dollars on constructing and reconstructing projects in the Middle Eastern countries. Earlier, Hromadski journalist Ostap Yarosh sat down with Salam Kawakibi, director of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies.
Putin needs war in Syria and either to keep his power because he has a lot of domestic problems, to keep the national solidarity around him, to have the legitimacy also in the view of some of his public opinion, local public opinion, and to reinforce his image, because the economy is very in bad situation in Russia. They don't have any real industry. They have a bad relation with all European and either American and even with some country in the Asian country. They need, as one of the advisors of Gorbachev told me, Putin without war, he cannot stay. And for that, I cannot believe that he can build peace or he can work for a peace solution. In Syria, it's a way to have a strong argument to negotiate with Western country on other issues, like on his annexation, occupation of Ukraine, of Crimea, of eastern Ukraine, of also he asked NATO to not putting missiles in Baltic countries. He wants his gas to sell his gas with preference price to Europe and to stop the importation from gas from other countries to Europe. He wants a lot of things, and Syrian issue, it's a good opportunity to use it like a card of negotiation, to bargaining better, to have a better position in this negotiation. And he don't want this negotiation with Europe, he wants to negotiate with America, only with America, because he believes, and it's not completely wrong, that when America decide, Europe follow.
You also mentioned during your talk that Aleppo is going to be rebuilt by Kadyrov's people. Can you please tell more about this situation, because it's not common known here in Ukraine of that?
No, Aleppo, it was destroyed, the eastern of the city, the old city, the historical side is completely destroyed. And Kadyrov, he engaged himself with with 10 or 12 million of dollars to rebuild the Umayyad mosques in the center of the old city. But also he sent more than 1,000 soldiers with the Russian flag, but they are Kadyrov soldiers, to be like military police in Aleppo, to control the city. It's also their matter to send a message to Iranian to not be very present in the city, because the Chechen come from Sunni community and the Iranian, they are Shia, and it's a message to try to make equilibrium inside of the city. But also, in the mind of the Russian administration, they said, Aleppo, it will be Grozny solution. What they mean about Grozny solution, it's Grozny solution that we destroyed everything and we rebuild everything on, like Grozny built it, like a new city without any respect of the historical memory or historical heritage. And now the UNESCO threat the government of Syria to preserve Aleppo, historical Aleppo, or they retired Aleppo from the universal patrimoine, because Aleppo is registered like a very old city, 7,000 years. And the mind of Kadyrov, the Grozny paradigm, is very present in the reconstruction of the city. We destroyed everything and we rebuilt the malls and new building, very kitsch and very lighting, to show the people that we rebuilt the peace, what they call the peace, on the bodies of the hundreds of thousands of citizens of Aleppo. People now in Aleppo, they have a hierarchy of occupation. They have Hezbollah from Lebanon. They have their own army. They consider it as occupation army. They have their own Syrian militia. They are afraid from those militia. And they have the Russian, the Chechen troops. And they believe that the Chechen, they are the most disciplined between all those other groups. And Russia played this card to convince people that you have the choice between worst and the worst than the worst. And they show them also they are Muslim like them. They stop their tank to make their prayer with them, and they rebuild their mosque. It's a huge propaganda for normal people can work, but for the awareness people it cannot work, because the occupation cannot be replaced by such propaganda.
Thank you from the entire team of Hromadske International for watching. We are here to explain Ukraine and Eastern Europe for you. And go to our webpage, en.hromadske.ua, sign up for our newsletter, follow us on Twitter and Facebook, search Hromadske International. We are here for you 24/7. With this, I say goodbye.